I had hoped to be watching a video I'd pre-recorded with a glass of wine, but unfortunately rural Herefordshire broadband had other ideas. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name's Tania Brown, which you might have discovered from the schedule, and I'm the first female secretary of the Vintage Sports Car Club. And a bit of an all-round car nut. So if you think vintage cars are just for old men, you're wrong. The Vintage Sports Car Club itself has a long history of women being involved. Back in the first committee meeting in 1934, there was a Mrs. Lewis, whose first name I'm afraid has been lost to me. She was the wife of E.T. Lewis, one of two men who wrote into a magazine at the time suggesting the formation of the Vintage Sports Car Club. By the third meeting, she'd been elevated to the committee itself, although she'd attended the previous two meetings, so I'm not quite sure what capacity she was there in. There are other better known women in the Vintage Sports Car Club history, people like Kay Petra and Marjorie Carson to name but two, but these aren't the women who directly inspired me. They're part of a fabric of a club that's always had women racers, nearly always had women on committee, and certainly has a long involvement of women in the club. Their more indirect influence, that fabric of the club, is one of the reasons why I fell in love with the club in the first place. Back when I used to be not even a teenager, I went to quite a few places, not least of all Cadwell, as I grew up in the Lincolnshire flatlands. And I got used to going to meetings and being asked, "Are you here with your dad? Are you here with your brother?" It was always like people felt you had to be there with a man. And I never got that when I went to the Vintage Sports Car Club. They didn't care that I was a child. They didn't care about people's colour or creed or sex. As long as you love the silly old cars, then you're welcome. And it was a breath of fresh air compared to a lot of other things. Now, some of that may be down to the historical involvement of the people I've mentioned, but it's also true that when I first started going in the early 90s, it may well be due to some of the women that were around then. I remember watching Rebecca Gunn campaigning her rather sporty Austin 7, a lot sportier than the one I'm sat in here talking to you today from. But there were other names. There was Judy Neve, now Judy Portway, Anne Shoesmith, Di Threlfall, Carol Spagg, to name but a few. But this is really about my story, so I'm going to go back to the beginning and talk about the main woman who influenced me. Back then, my nan had married her second husband and moved from Stroud over to Lincolnshire. My parents had divorced and my mum and I moved in with them temporarily. My grandfather was the proud owner of the Bourne cycle car, which he'd purchased from Harry Bourne for 60 woodbines. And he used to drive that round the Stroud area and met several stalwarts of the V.S.C.C. Over time, my nan and Pat got involved with marshalling, and that ended up with them also marshalling for the Midland Automobile Club at Shelsley Walsh. So when I moved over to my grandparents' house, I'd pack in the car on a weekend and take the mere 3-hour drive over to Shelsley Walsh. I was often at a loose end, but it was something of a family affair. My grandfather Pat has been on the start line there with the chock for many, many years, and if you ever see a picture of the Napier Bentley, he's probably the person on the chock there. His brother-in-law marshalled in the finish paddock, and his sister-in-law was in the timing hut, which is where Nan started. But Nan later became known as the Kennel Maid and is forever associated with Kennel Bend at Shelsley. There she had her rescue boys, who she loved. It really was quite a family affair, and you nearly always couldn't quite get into competing at Shelsley without coming across one of us, and I hope that's a tradition I'm something carrying on. I attended all the V.S.C.C meetings, and if we weren't doing anything else, we went to Cadwell Park. By the time I was a teenager, I was probably doing about 30 weekends a year with my grandparents, and I got into marshalling because I was quite bored of being at a loose end. My nan was a kind and gentle person, but if you got on the wrong side of her, you sure knew about it. I remember doing paddock with her at Cadwell. We had two drivers who'd had something of a fracas on track, came off, and we were trying to send them to Parc Ferme. They ignored me and Nan, which probably some of the vintage boys will tell you is not a safe thing to do, and promptly parked their cars just down the road from where we were stood, got out and looked like they were about to punch each other. I decided it was probably best for Nan not to get in the middle of that because, as I said, she was a pint-sized ferocious woman. So instead, the 12-year-old, probably me at the time, marched in between them, wagging my finger, straining my neck looking up at them, and told them they better get back in their cars, go to Parc Ferme, or I'd send them to the clerk of the course to get a telling off. I wonder who I picked that up from. I think, I'm not 100% certain, but I think the clerk of the course at that meeting was V.S.C.C, another great woman. You certainly wouldn't want to be on the end of a tongue lashing from her. So I don't know whether it was the shock of being told off by a child or the threat of V.S.C., but they promptly got back in their cars and did go down to Parc Fermé. From then on, there was no denying that I was my nan's granddaughter. The genes rung strong, and I've even got the finger wag down to a fine art. The other thing with Nan and Kennel is she loved her rescue boys there. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2008, and it was only a few short weeks later that she passed away. We had just long enough to talk to her about her funeral arrangements and what she wanted to happen. She wanted her ashes scattered at Kennel, but she told us not to put them somewhere where her rescue boys would relieve themselves. Now, any of the rescue boys will tell you that my nan didn't use the word relieve. It was something a bit stronger than that, and I think I've probably picked the vocabulary up from her as well. But that's not the only women that are around and about. I've been on committee with V.S.C.C for quite some time, and becoming club secretary was never one of my plans. However, when the search was going on, I had a joking conversation with the president, Paul Tunnicliffe, who'd taken over from the first female president, Jenny Lees, another influence of mine. And jokingly said to him, well, you have my phone number if you don't find any suitable candidates. Despite rumours to the contrary, just because I was on committee, I was by no means a shoo-in, and I went through a rather rigorous selection process. But I was very honoured when I got the phone call to offer me the job, and I'm slightly amazed still to this day that I'm the first female secretary, not just because it's me, but because there's been so many women involved in the club before, even going back to people like Gillian Carr and Sadie Wigglesworth, who were staff in the club and now have gone on to do great things within the motorsport industry. It does bring to mind the late Joy Rainey, another wonderful influence of mine, who could be occasionally disparaging about the Ladies' Award. She used to campaign in the British Hill Climb Championship, and she always felt that she was mixing it with the boys on equal terms, so she didn't need a Ladies' Award. And I feel a little bit the same about being club secretary sometimes. Whilst I'm proud I'm the first female, really I want to be judged on my own merits, not just because I've got a pair of boobs, great as they may be. And I'm sure Joy would laugh at that as well. There have been many great club secretaries, many with great women behind them as well. But really what I want my legacy to be is that it's much easier for whoever comes after me, male or female, and if it inspires just one woman to go on and do something else, then that would be a brilliant thing as far as I'm concerned. There's so many women that inspire me today that if I was to sit here and name them all, I'd need another 10 minutes. And I'm sure many of the vintage racers, and I can see people like Ben and Bo are watching, will know many of the names. Jo Waterfield, Rebecca Gunn, who I've already mentioned. We have so many of them, and we're so lucky. And I'm so lucky that I'm in a club that really, it doesn't matter that I'm a woman. Everything's been accepted. We're much further forward than many people with that. Having seen the discussions with Lewis Hamilton and his Sports Personality of the Year award, there's still quite some strides to be made within motorsport generally for there to be equality and lack of discrimination between sexes and between people of different races. And that's why I'm talking about this today. I'm not normally one who will talk about female versus male. I normally just try and get on and accept people as they are. But I felt it was important to talk about some of the wonderful people that we have, not the discrimination we face, because we should be looking at the good influences and the people who've gone before us. But for all those women that are still around now and inspire me every day, I just want to say thank you. You've been part of my life, and for that, I'm always grateful.